Section 5 of the Critique of Pure Reason. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Carl Manchester, 2007. The Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant. Transcendental Doctrine of Elements. Part 1st. Transcendental Aesthetic. Section 2 of Time. 5. Metaphysical exposition of this conception. 1. Time is not an empirical conception, for neither coexistence nor succession would be perceived by us if the representation of time did not exist as a foundation a priori. Without this presupposition, we could not represent to ourselves that things exist together at one and the same time or at different times, that is, contemporaneously or in succession. 2. Time is a necessary representation, lying at the foundation of all our intuitions. With regard to phenomena in general, we cannot think away time from them, and represent them to ourselves as out of and unconnected with time, but we can quite well represent to ourselves time void of phenomena. Time is therefore given a priori. In it alone is all reality of phenomena possible. These may all be annihilated in thought, but time itself, as the universal condition of their possibility, cannot be so annulled. 3. On this necessity a priori is also founded the possibility of apodiactic principles of the relations of time, or axioms of time in general, such as time has only one dimension, different times are not coexistent but successive, as different spaces are not successive but coexistent. These principles cannot be derived from experience, for it would give neither strict universality nor apodiactic certainty. We should only be able to say, so common experience teaches us, but not, it must be so. They are valid rules, through which, in general, experience is possible, and they instruct us respecting experience, and not by means of it. 4. Time is not a discursive, or as it is called, general conception, but a pure form of the sensuous intuition. Different times are merely parts of one and the same time, but the representation which can only be given by a single object is an intuition. Besides, the proposition that different times cannot be coexistent could not be derived from a general conception, for this proposition is synthetical, and therefore cannot spring out of conceptions alone. It is therefore contained immediately in the intuition and representation of time. 5. The infinity of time signifies nothing more than that every determined quantity of time is possible only through limitations of one time lying at the foundation. Consequently, the original representation, time, must be given as unlimited, but as the determinate representation of the parts of time and of every quantity of an object can only be obtained by limitation, the complete representation of time must not be furnished by means of conceptions, for these contain only partial representations. Conceptions, on the contrary, must have immediate intuition for their basis. 6. Transcendental exposition of the conception of time. I may here refer to what is said above, where, for sake of brevity, I have placed under the head of metaphysical exposition that which is properly transcendental. Here I shall add that the conception of change, and with it the conception of motion as change of place, is possible only through and in the representation of time. That if this representation were not an intuition, internal, a priori, no conception of whatever kind could render comprehensible the possibility of change, in other words, of a conjunction of contradictorily opposed predicates in one and the same object, for example, the presence of a thing in a place and the non-presence of the same thing in the same place. It is only in time that it is possible to meet with two contradictorily opposed determinations in one thing, that is, after each other. Thus our conception of time explains the possibility of so much synthetical knowledge a priori, as is exhibited in the general doctrine of motion, which is not a little fruitful. 7. Conclusions from the above conceptions. A. Time is not something which subsists of itself, or which inheres in a thing as an objective determination, and therefore remains, when abstraction is made of the subjective conditions of the intuition of things. For in the former case, it would be something real, yet without presenting to any power of perception any real object. In the latter case, as an order of determination inherent in things themselves, it could not be antecedent to things as their condition, nor discerned or intuited by means of synthetical propositions a priori. But all this is quite possible when we regard time as merely the subjective condition under which all our intuitions take place. For in that case, this form of the inward intuition can be represented prior to the objects, and consequently a priori. B. Time is nothing else than the form of the internal sense, that is, of the intuitions of self and of our internal state. For time cannot be any determination of outward phenomena. It has to do neither with shape nor position. On the contrary, it determines the relation of representations in our internal state. And precisely because this internal intuition presents to us no shape or form, we endeavour to supply this want by analogies, and represent the course of time by a line progressing to infinity, the content of which constitutes a series which is only of one dimension, and we conclude from the properties of this line as to all the properties of time, with the single exception that the parts of the line are coexistent, whilst those of time are successive. From this it is clear also that the representation of time is itself an intuition, because all its relations can be expressed in an external intuition. C. Time is the formal condition a priori of all phenomena whatsoever. Space, as the pure form of external intuition, is limited as a condition a priori to external phenomena alone. On the other hand, because all representations, whether they have or have not external things for their objects, still in themselves as determinations of the mind, belong to our internal state. And because this internal state is subject to the formal condition of the internal intuition, that is, to time, time is a condition a priori of all phenomena whatsoever, the immediate condition of all internal, and thereby the mediate condition of all external phenomena. If I can say a priori all outward phenomena are in space and determined a priori according to the relations of space, I can also, from the principle of the internal sense, affirm universally all phenomena in general, that is, all objects of the senses, are in time, and stand necessarily in relations of time. If we abstract our internal intuition of ourselves and all external intuitions, possible only by virtue of this internal intuition, and presented to us by our faculty of representation, and consequently take objects as they are in themselves, then time is nothing. It is only of objective validity in regard to phenomena, because these are things which we regard as objects of our senses. It no longer objective, we make abstraction of the sensuousness of our intuition, in other words, of that mode of representation which is peculiar to us, and speak of things in general. Time is therefore merely a subjective condition of our human intuition, which is always sensuous, that is, so far as we are affected by objects, and in itself, independently of the mind or subject, is nothing. Nevertheless, in respect of all phenomena, consequently of all things which come within the sphere of our experience, it is necessarily objective. We cannot say all things are in time, because in this conception of things in general, we abstract and make no mention of any sort of intuition of things. But this is the proper condition under which time belongs to our representation of objects. If we add the condition to the conception and say, all things as phenomena, that is, objects of sensuous intuition, are in time, then the proposition has its sound objective validity and universality a priori. What we have now set forth teaches, therefore, the empirical reality of time, that is, its objective validity in reference to all objects which can ever be presented to our senses. And as our intuition is always sensuous, No object ever can be presented to us in experience which does not come under the conditions of time. On the other hand, we deny to time all claim to absolute reality, that is, we deny that it, without having regard to the form of our sensuous intuition, absolutely inheres in things as a condition or property. Such properties as belong to objects as things in themselves never can be presented to us through the medium of the senses. Herein consists, therefore, the transcendental ideality of time, according to which, if we abstract the subjective conditions of sensuous intuition, it is nothing, and cannot be reckoned as subsisting or inhering in objects as things in themselves, independently of its relation to our intuition. This ideality, like that of space, is not to be proved or illuminated by fallacious analogies with sensations, for this reason, that in such arguments or illustrations we make the presupposition that the phenomenon in which such and such predicates inhere has objective reality, while in this case we can only find such an objective reality as is itself empirical, that is, regards the object as a mere phenomenon. In reference to this subject, see the remark in section 1, subsection 4. 8. Elucidation. Against this theory, which grants empirical reality to time but denies it to absolute and transcendental reality, I have heard from intelligent men an objection so unanimously urged that I conclude that it must naturally present itself to every reader to whom these considerations are novel. It runs thus: changes are real. This the continual change in our own representations demonstrates, even though the existence of all external phenomena, together with their changes, is denied. Now, changes are only possible in time, and therefore time must be something real. But there is no difficulty in answering this. I grant the whole argument. Time, no doubt, is something real, that is, it is the real form of our internal intuition. It therefore has subjective reality in reference to our internal experience, that is, I have really the representation of time, and of my determinations therein. Time, therefore, is not to be regarded as an object, but as the mode of representation of myself as an object. But if I could intuit myself, or be intuited by another thing, without this condition of sensibility, then those very determinations which we now represent to ourselves as changes would present to us a knowledge in which the representations of time, and consequently of change, would not appear. The empirical reality of time, therefore, remains as the condition of all our experience, but absolute reality, according to what has been said above, cannot be granted it. Time is nothing but the form of our internal intuition. Footnote. I can indeed say, my representations follow one another, or are successive, but this means only that we are conscious of them as in a succession, that is, according to the form of the internal sense. Time, therefore, is not a thing in itself, nor is it any objective determination pertaining to or inherent in things. End footnote. If we take away from it the special condition of our sensibility, the conception of time also vanishes, and it inheres not in the objects themselves, but solely in the subject, or mind, which intuits them. But the reason why this objection is so unanimously brought against our doctrine of time, and that too by disputants who cannot start any intelligible arguments against the doctrine of the ideality of space, is this: they have no hope of demonstrating apodiactically the absolute reality of space, because the doctrine of idealism is against them, according to which the reality of external objects is not capable of any strict proof. On the other hand, the reality of the object of our internal sense, that is, myself and my internal state, is clear immediately through consciousness. The former, external objects in space, might be a mere delusion, but the latter, the object of my internal perception, is undeniably real. They do not, however, reflect that both, without question of their reality as representations, belong only to the genus phenomenon, which has always two aspects: the one, the object considered as a thing in itself, without regard to the mode of intuiting it, and the nature of which remains for this very reason problematical. The other, the form of our intuition of the object, which must be sought not in the object as a thing in itself, but in the subject to which it appears, which form of intuition nevertheless belongs really and necessarily to the phenomenal object. Time and space are, therefore, two sources of knowledge, from which, a priori, various synthetical cognitions can be drawn. Of this we find a striking example in the cognitions of space and its relations, which form the foundation of pure mathematics. They are the two pure forms of all intuitions, and thereby make synthetical propositions a priori possible. But these sources of knowledge, being merely conditions of our sensibility, do therefore, and as such, strictly determine their own range and purpose, in that they do not and cannot present objects as things in themselves, but are applicable to them solely in so far as they are considered as sensuous phenomena. The sphere of phenomena is the only sphere of their validity, and if we venture out of this, no further objective use can be made of them. For the rest, this formal reality of time and space leaves the validity of our empirical knowledge unshaken, for our certainty in that respect is equally firm, whether these forms necessarily inhere in the things themselves, or only in our intuition of them. On the other hand, those who maintain the absolute reality of time and space, whether as essentially subsisting or only inhering as modifications in things, must find themselves at utter variance with the principles of experience itself. For, if they decide for the first view, and make space and time into substances, this being the side taken by mathematical natural philosophers, they must admit two self-subsisting non-entities, infinite and eternal, which exist, yet without there being anything real, for the purpose of containing in themselves everything that is real. If they adopt the second view of inherence, which is preferred by some metaphysical natural philosophers, and regard space and time as relations, contiguity in space or succession in time, abstracted from experience, though represented confusedly in this state of separation, they find themselves in that case necessitated to deny the validity of mathematical doctrines a priori in reference to real things, for example, in space. At all events their apodeictic certainty, for such certainty cannot be found in an a posteriori proposition, and the conceptions a priori of space and time are, according to this opinion, mere creations of the imagination, having their source really in experience, inasmuch as, out of relations abstracted from experience, imagination has made up something which contains, indeed, general statements of these relations, yet of which no application can be made without the restrictions attached thereto by nature. The former of these parties gains this advantage, that they keep the sphere of phenomena free for mathematical science. On the other hand, these very conditions, space and time, embarrass them greatly, when the understanding endeavours to pass the limits of that sphere. The latter has indeed this advantage, that the representations of space and time do not come in their way when they wish to judge of objects not as phenomena, but merely in their relation to the understanding. Devoid, however, of a true and objectively valid a priori intuition, they can neither furnish any basis for the possibility of mathematical cognitions a priori, nor bring the propositions of experience into necessary accordance with those of mathematics. In our theory of the true nature of these two original forms of the sensibility, both difficulties are surmounted. In conclusion, that transcendental aesthetic cannot contain any more than these two elements, space and time, is sufficiently obvious from the fact that all other conceptions appertaining to sensibility, even that of motion, which unites in itself both elements, presuppose something empirical. Motion, for example, presupposes the perception of something movable, but space considered in itself contains nothing movable. Consequently, motion must be something which is found in space only through experience, in other words, an empirical datum. In like manner, transcendental aesthetic cannot number the conception of change among its data a priori, for time itself does not change, but only something which is in time. To acquire the conception of change, therefore, the perception of some existing object and the succession of its determinants, in one word experience, is necessary. 9. General remarks on transcendental aesthetic. 1. In order to prevent any misunderstanding, it will be requisite, in the first place, to recapitulate as clearly as possible what our opinion is with respect to the fundamental nature of our sensuous cognition in general. We have intended, then, to say that all our intuition is nothing but the representation of phenomena, that the things which we intuit are not in themselves the same as our representations of them in intuition, nor are their relations in themselves so constituted as they appear to us, and that if we take away the subject, or even only the subjective constitution of our senses in general, then not only the nature and relations of objects in space and time, but even space and time themselves disappear, and that these, as phenomena, cannot exist in themselves, but only in us. What may be the nature of objects considered as things in themselves, and without reference to the receptivity of our sensibility, is quite unknown to us. We know nothing more than our mode of perceiving them, which is peculiar to us, and which, though not of necessity pertaining to every animated being, is so to the whole human race. With this alone we have to do. Space and time are the pure forms thereof, sensation the matter. The former alone we can cognize a priori, that is, antecedent to all actual perception, and for this reason such cognition is called pure intuition. The latter is that in our cognition which is called cognition a posteriori, that is, empirical intuition. The former appertain absolutely and necessarily to our sensibility, of whatsoever kind our sensations may be. The latter may be of very diversified character. Supposing that we should carry our empirical intuition even to the very highest degree of clearness, we should not thereby advance one step nearer to a knowledge of the constitution of objects as things in themselves, for we could only, at best, arrive at a complete cognition of our own mode of intuition, that is, of our sensibility, and this always under the conditions originally attaching to the subject, namely the conditions of space and time, while the question, what are objects considered as things in themselves, remains unanswerable, even after the most thorough examination of the phenomenal world. To say, then, that all our sensibility is nothing but the confused representation of things containing exclusively that which belongs to them as things in themselves, and this under an accumulation of characteristic marks and partial representations which we cannot distinguish in consciousness, is a falsification of the conception of sensibility and phenomenization, which renders our whole doctrine thereof empty and useless. The difference between a confused and a clear representation is merely logical, and has nothing to do with content. No doubt the conception of right, as employed by a sound understanding, contains all that the most subtle investigation could unfold from it, although, in the ordinary practical use of the word, we are not conscious of the manifold representations comprised in the conception. But we cannot, for this reason, assert that the ordinary conception is a sensuous one, containing a mere phenomenon, for right cannot appear as a phenomenon, but the conception of it lies in the understanding, and represents a property, the moral property, of actions, which belongs to them in themselves. On the other hand, the representation in intuition of a body contains nothing which could belong to an object considered as a thing in itself, but merely the phenomenon or appearance of something, and the mode in which we are affected by that appearance. And this receptivity of our faculty of cognition is called sensibility, and remains toto caello, diametrically, different from the cognition of an object in itself, even though we should examine the content of the phenomenon to the very bottom. It must be admitted that the Leibniz-Wolffian philosophy has assigned an entirely erroneous point of view to all investigations into the nature and origin of our cognitions, inasmuch as it regards the distinction between the sensuous and the intellectual as merely logical, whereas it is plainly transcendental, and concerns not merely the clearness or obscurity, but the content and origin of both. For the faculty of sensibility not only does not present us with an indistinct and confused cognition of objects as things in themselves, but, in fact, gives us no knowledge of these at all. On the contrary, so soon as we abstract in thought our own subjective nature, the object represented, with the properties ascribed to it by sensuous intuition, entirely disappears, because it was only this subjective nature that determined the form of the object as a phenomenon. In phenomena, we commonly, indeed, distinguish that which essentially belongs to the intuition of them, and is valid for the sensuous faculty of every human being, from that which belongs to the same intuition accidentally, as valid not for the sensuous faculty in general, but for a particular state or organisation of this or that sense. Accordingly, we are accustomed to say that the former is a cognition which represents the object itself, whilst the latter presents only a particular appearance or phenomenon thereof. This distinction, however, is only empirical. If we stop here, as is usual, and do not regard the empirical intuition as itself a mere phenomenon, as we ought to do, in which nothing that can appertain to a thing in itself is to be found, our transcendental distinction is lost, and we believe that we cognize objects as things in themselves, although in the whole range of the sensuous world, investigate the nature of its objects as profoundly as we may, we have to do with nothing but phenomena. Thus we call the rainbow a mere appearance of phenomena in a sunny shower, and the rain the reality or thing in itself, and this is right enough if we understand the latter conception in a merely physical sense, that is, as that which in universal experience and under whatever conditions of sensuous perception is known in intuition to be so and so determined, and not otherwise. But if we consider this empirical datum generally, and inquire, without reference to its accordance with our senses, whether there can be discovered in it aught which represents an object as a thing in itself, the raindrops, of course, are not such, for they are, as phenomena, empirical objects. The question of the relation of the representation to the object is transcendental, and not only are the raindrops mere phenomena, but even their circular form, nay, the space itself through which they fall, is nothing in itself, but both are mere modifications or fundamental dispositions of our sensuous intuition, whilst the transcendental object remains for us utterly unknown. The second important concern of our aesthetic is that it does not obtain favour merely as a plausible hypothesis, but possesses as undoubted a character of certainty as can be demanded of any theory which is to serve for an organon. In order fully to convince the reader of this certainty, we shall select a case which will serve to make its validity apparent, and also to illustrate what has been said in subsection 3. Suppose, then, that space and time are in themselves objective, and conditions of the possibility of objects as things in themselves. In the first place, it is evident that both present us with very many apodiactic and synthetic propositions a priori, but especially space, and for this reason we shall prefer it for investigation at present. As the propositions of geometry are cognized synthetically a priori, and with apodiactic certainty, I inquire, whence do you obtain propositions of this kind, and on what basis does the understanding rest, in order to arrive at such absolutely necessary and universally valid truths? There is no other way than through intuitions or conceptions as such, and these are given either a priori or a posteriori. The latter, namely empirical conceptions, together with the empirical intuition on which they are founded, cannot afford any synthetical proposition, except such as is itself also empirical, that is, a proposition of experience. But an empirical proposition cannot possess the qualities of necessity and absolute universality, which, nevertheless, are the characteristics of all geometrical propositions. As to the first and only means to arrive at such cognitions, namely, through mere conceptions or intuitions a priori, it is quite clear that from mere conceptions no synthetical cognitions, but only analytical ones, can be obtained. Take, for example, the proposition, two straight lines cannot enclose a space, and with these alone no figure is possible, and try to deduce from it the conception of a straight line and the number 2, or take the proposition, it is possible to construct a figure with 3 straight lines, and endeavour in like manner to deduce from it the mere conception of a straight line and the number 3. All your endeavours are in vain, and you find yourself forced to have recourse to intuition as, in fact, geometry always does. You therefore give yourself an object in intuition. But of what kind is this intuition? Is it a pure a priori, or is it an empirical intuition? If the latter, then neither a universally valid, much less an apodeictic proposition, can arise from it, for experience never can give us any such proposition. You must therefore give yourself an object a priori in intuition, and upon that ground your synthetical proposition. Now if there did not exist within you a faculty of intuition a priori, if this subjective condition were not in respect to its form also the universal condition a priori under which alone the object of this external intuition is itself possible, if the object, that is the triangle, was something in itself, without any relation to you the subject, how could you affirm that that which lies necessarily in your subjective conditions in order to construct a triangle must also necessarily belong to the triangle in itself? For to your conceptions of 3 lines you could not add anything new, that is the figure, which, therefore, must necessarily be found in the object, because the object is given before your cognition, and not by means of it. If, therefore, space, and time also, were not a mere form of your intuition, which contains conditions a priori, under which alone things can become external objects for you, and without which subjective conditions the objects are in themselves nothing, you could not construct any synthetical proposition whatsoever regarding external objects. It is therefore not merely possible or probable, but indubitably certain, that space and time, as the necessary conditions of all our external and internal experience, are merely subjective conditions of all our intuitions, in relation to which all objects are therefore mere phenomena, and not things in themselves, presented to us in this particular manner. And for this reason, in respect to the form of phenomena, much may be said a priori, whilst of the thing in itself, which may lie at the foundation of these phenomena, it is impossible to say anything. 2. In confirmation of this theory of the ideality of the external as well as internal sense, consequently of all objects of sense as mere phenomena, we may especially remark that all in our cognition that belongs to intuition contains nothing more than mere relations. The feelings of pain and pleasure, and the will, which are not cognitions, are accepted. The relations to wit of place in an intuition, extension, change of place, motion, and laws according to which this change is determined, moving forces. That, however, which is present in this or that place, or any operation going on or result taking place in the things themselves, with the exception of change of place, is not given to us by intuition. Now, by means of mere relations, a thing cannot be known in itself, and it may therefore be fairly concluded that, as through the external sense nothing but mere representations of relations are given to us, the said external sense in its representation can contain only the relation of the object to the subject, but not the essential nature of the object as a thing in itself. The same is the case with the internal intuition, not only because in the internal intuition the representation of the external senses constitutes the material with which the mind is occupied, but because time, in which we place, and which itself antecedes the consciousness of, these representations in experience, and which, as the formal condition of the mode according to which objects are placed in the mind, lies at the foundation of them, contains relations of the successive, the coexistent, and of that which always must be coexistent with succession, the permanent. Now, that which as representation can antecede every exercise of thought of an object is intuition, and when it contains nothing but relations, it is the form of the intuition which, as it presents us with no representation, except in so far as something is placed in the mind, can be nothing else than the mode in which the mind is affected by its own activity, to wit, its presenting to itself representations. Consequently, the mode in which the mind is affected by itself, that is, it can be nothing but an internal sense in respect to its form. Everything that is represented through the medium of sense is so far phenomenal. Consequently, we must either refuse altogether to admit an internal sense, or the subject, which is the object of that sense, could only be represented by it as phenomenon, and not as it would judge of itself, if its intuition were pure spontaneous activity, that is, were intellectual. The difficulty here lies wholly in the question, how can the subject have an internal intuition of itself? But this difficulty is common to every theory. The consciousness of self, apperception, is the simple representation of the ego, and if by means of that representation alone all the manifold representations in the subject were spontaneously given, then our internal intuition would be intellectual. This consciousness in man requires an internal perception of the manifold representations which are previously given in the subject, and the manner in which these representations are given in the mind without spontaneity must, on account of this difference, the want of spontaneity, be called sensibility. If the faculty of self-consciousness is to apprehend what lies in the mind, it must all act that, and can in this way alone produce an intuition of self. But the form of this intuition, which lies in the original constitution of the mind, determines in the representation of time the manner in which the manifold representations are to combine themselves in the mind, since a subject intuits itself not as it would represent itself immediately and spontaneously, but according to the manner in which the mind is internally affected, consequently as it appears and not as it is. 3. When we say that the intuition of external objects, and also the self-intuition of the subject, represent both objects and subject in space and time as they affect our senses, that is, as they appear, this is by no means equivalent to asserting that these objects are merely illusory appearances. For when we speak of things as phenomena, the objects, nay, even the properties which we ascribe them, are looked upon as really given, only that in so far as this or that property depends upon the mode of intuition of the subject in the relation of the given object to the subject, the object as phenomena is to be distinguished from the object as a thing in itself. Thus I do not say that bodies seem or appear to be external to me, or that my soul seems merely to be given in my self-consciousness, although I maintain that the properties of space and time, in conformity to which I set both as the condition of their existence, abide in my mode of intuition, and not in the objects in themselves. It would be my own fault if out of that which I should reckon as phenomenon I made mere illusory appearance. Footnote. The predicates of the phenomenon can be affixed to the object itself in relation to our sensuous faculty, for example, the red colour or the perfume to the rose. But illusory appearance never can be attributed as a predicate to an object, for this very reason, that it attributes to this object in itself that which belongs to it only in relation to our sensuous faculty, or to the subject in general, e.g. the two handles which were formerly ascribed to Saturn. That which is never to be found in the object itself, but always in the relation of the object to the subject, and which moreover is inseparable from our representation of the object, we denominate phenomenon. Thus the predicates of space and time are rightly attributed to objects of the senses as such, and in this there is no illusion. On the contrary, if I ascribe redness of the rose as a thing in itself, or to Saturn his handles, or extension to all external objects, considered as things in themselves, without regarding the determinate relation of these objects to the subject, and without limiting my judgment to that relation, then, and then only, arises illusion. End footnote. But this will not happen, because of our principle of the ideality of all sensuous intuitions. On the contrary, if we ascribe objective reality to these forms of representation, it becomes impossible to avoid changing everything into mere appearance. For if we regard space and time as properties which must be found in objects as things in themselves, as sine quibus non of the possibility of their existence, and reflect on the absurdities in which we then find ourselves involved, inasmuch as we are compelled to admit the existence of two infinite things, which are nevertheless not substances, nor anything really inhering in substances, nay, to admit that they are the necessary conditions of the existence of all things, and moreover that they must continue to exist, although all existing things were annihilated, we cannot blame the good Berkeley for degrading bodies to mere illusory appearances. Nay, even our own existence, which would in this case depend upon the self-existent reality of such a mere nonentity as time, would necessarily be changed with it into mere appearance, an absurdity which no one has yet been guilty of. 4. In natural theology, where we think of an object, God, which can never be an object of intuition to us, and even to himself can never be an object of sensuous intuition, we carefully avoid attributing to this intuition the conditions of space and time, and intuition all his cognition must be, and not thought, which always includes limitation. But with what right can we do this, if we make them forms of objects as things in themselves, and such moreover as would continue to exist as a priori conditions of the existence of things, even though the things themselves were annihilated? For as conditions of all existence in general, space and time must be conditions of the existence of the Supreme Being also. But if we do not thus make them objective forms of all things, there is no other way left than to make them subjective forms of our mode of intuition, external and internal, which is called sensuous because it is not primitive, that is not such as gives in itself the existence of the object of the intuition, a mode of intuition which, so far as we can judge, can belong only to the Creator, but is dependent on the existence of the object, is possible therefore only on condition that the representative faculty of the subject is affected by the object. It is, moreover, not necessary that we should limit the mode of intuition in space and time to the sensuous faculty of man. It may well be that all finite thinking beings must necessarily in this respect agree with man, though as to this we cannot decide. But sensibility does not, on account of this universality, cease to be sensibility for this very reason, that it is deduced, intuitus derivativus, and not an original, intuitus originarius, consequently not an intellectual intuition, and this intuition as such, for reasons above mentioned, seems to belong solely to the Supreme Being, but never to a being dependent, quoad its existence, as well as its intuition, which its existence determines and limits relatively to given objects. This latter remark, however, must be taken only as an illustration, and not as any proof of the truth of our aesthetical theory. Subsection 10. Conclusion of the Transcendental Aesthetic. We have now completely before us one part of the solution of the grand general problem of transcendental philosophy, namely the question, how are synthetical propositions a priori possible? That is to say, we have shown that we are in possession of pure a priori intuitions, namely space and time, in which we find, when in a judgment a priori we pass out beyond the given conception, something which is not discoverable in that conception, but is certainly found a priori in the intuition which corresponds to the conception, and can be united synthetically with it. But the judgments which these pure intuitions enable us to make never reach farther than to objects of the senses, and are valid only for objects of possible experience. End of section 5.
Section 6. The Critique of Pure Reason, by Immanuel Kant. Transcendental Doctrine of Elements. Part 2nd. Transcendental Logic. Introduction. Idea of a Transcendental Logic.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gemma Blythe. The Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant. Section 6. Second part. Transcendental Logic. Introduction. Idea of a transcendental logic. 1. Of logic in general. Our knowledge springs from two main sources in the mind, first of which is the faculty or power of receiving representations, receptivity for impressions. The second is the power of cognizing by means of these representations, spontaneity in the production of conceptions. Through the first, an object is given to us. Through the second, it is in relation to the representation, which is a mere determination of the mind, thought. Intuition and conceptions constitute, therefore, the elements of all our knowledge, so that neither conceptions without an intuition in some way corresponding to them, nor intuition without conceptions can afford us a cognition. Both are either pure or empirical. They are empirical when sensation, which presupposes the actual presence of the object, is contained in them, and pure when no sensation is mixed with the representation. Sensations we may call the matter of sensuous cognition. Pure intuition, consequently, contains merely the form under which something is intuited, and pure conception only the form of the thought of an object. Only pure intuitions and pure conceptions are possible a priori, the empirical only a posteriori. We apply the term sensibility to the receptivity of the mind for impressions, in so far as it is in some way affected, and, on the other hand, we call the faculty of spontaneously producing representations, or the spontaneity of cognition, understanding. Our nature is so constituted that intuition with us never can be other than sensuous. That is, it contains only the mode in which we are affected by objects. On the other hand, the faculty of thinking, the object of sensuous intuition, is the understanding. Neither of these faculties has a preference over the other. Without the sensuous faculty, no object would be given to us, and without the understanding, no object would be thought. Thoughts without content are void. Intuitions without conceptions, blind. Hence it is as necessary for the mind to make its conceptions sensuous, that is, to join to them the object in intuition, as to make its intuitions intelligible, that is, to bring them under conceptions. Neither of these faculties can exchange its proper function. Understanding cannot intuit, and the sensuous faculty cannot think. In no other way than from the united operation of both can knowledge arise. But no one ought, on this account, to overlook the difference of the elements contributed by each. We have rather great reason carefully to separate and distinguish them. We therefore distinguish the science of the laws of sensibility, that is, aesthetic, from the science of the laws of the understanding, that is, logic. Now, logic in its turn may be considered as twofold, namely, as logic of the general, or of the particular use of the understanding. The first contains the absolutely necessary laws of thought, without which no use whatsoever of the understanding is possible, and gives laws, therefore, to the understanding, without regard to the difference of objects on which it may be employed. The logic of the particular use of the understanding contains the laws of correct thinking upon a particular class of objects. The former may be called elemental logic, the latter the organon of this or that particular science. The latter is for the most part employed in the schools as a propedeutic to the sciences, although, indeed, according to the course of human reason, it is the last thing we arrive at, when the science has been already matured, and needs only the finishing touches towards its correction and completion. For our knowledge of the objects of our attempted science must be tolerably extensive and complete before we can indicate the laws by which a science of these objects can be established. General logic is again either pure or applied. In the former, we abstract all the empirical conditions under which the understanding is exercised. For example, the influence of the senses, the play of the fantasy or imagination, the laws of the memory, the force of habit, of inclination, etc. Consequently also the sources of prejudice. In a word, we abstract all causes from which particular cognitions arise, because these causes regard the understanding, under certain circumstances, of its application, and to the knowledge of them experience is required. Pure general logic has to do, therefore, merely with pure a priori principles, and is a canon of understanding and reason, but only in respect of the formal part of their use, be the content what it may, empirical or transcendental. General logic is called applied when it is directed to the laws of the use of the understanding, under the subjective empirical conditions which psychology teaches us. It has therefore empirical principles, although at the same time it is in so far general that it applies to the exercise of the understanding without regard to the difference of objects. On this account, moreover, it is neither a canon of the understanding in general, nor an organon of a particular science, but merely a cathartic of the human understanding. In general logic, therefore, that part which constitutes pure logic must be carefully distinguished from that which constitutes applied, though still general, logic. The former alone is properly science, although short and dry, as the methodical exposition of an elemental doctrine of the understanding ought to be. In this, therefore, logicians must always bear in mind two rules. 1. As a general logic, it makes abstraction of all content of the cognition of the understanding, and of the difference of objects, and has to do with nothing but the mere form of thought. 2. As pure logic, it has no empirical principles, and consequently draws nothing, contrary to the common persuasion, from psychology, which therefore has no influence on the canon of the understanding. It is a demonstrated doctrine, and everything in it must be certain completely a priori. What I called applied logic, contrary to the common acceptation of this term, according to which it should contain certain exercises for the scholar, for which pure logic gives the rules, is a representation of the understanding, and of the rules of its necessary employment in concreto, that is to say, under the accidental conditions of the subject, which may either hinder or promote this employment, and which are all given only empirically. Thus applied logic treats of attention, its impediments and consequences, of the origin of error, of the state of doubt, hesitation, conviction, etc., and to it is related pure general logic in the same way that pure morality, which contains only the necessary moral laws of a free will, is related to practical ethics, which considers these laws under all the impediments of feelings, inclinations, and passions to which men are more or less subjected, and which never can furnish us with a true and demonstrated science, because it, as well as applied logic, requires empirical and psychological principles. 2. Of transcendental logic. General logic, as we have seen, makes abstraction of all content of cognition, that is, of all relation of cognition to its object, and regards only the logical form in the relation of cognitions to each other, that is, the form of thought in general. But as we have both pure and empirical intuitions, as transcendental aesthetic proves, in like manner a distinction might be drawn between pure and empirical thought of objects. In this case there would exist a kind of logic in which we should not make abstraction of all content of cognition, or logic which should comprise merely the laws of pure thought of an object would, of course, exclude all those cognitions which were of empirical content. This kind of logic would also examine the origin of our cognitions of objects, so far as that origin cannot be ascribed to the objects themselves, while, on the contrary, general logic has nothing to do with the origin of our cognitions, but contemplates our representations, be they given primitively, a priori, in ourselves, or be they only in empirical origin, solely according to the laws which the understanding observes in employing them in the process of thought in relation to each other. Consequently, general logic treats of the form of the understanding only, which can be applied to representations from whatever source they may have arisen. And here I shall make a remark which the reader must bear well in mind in the course of the following considerations, to wit, that not every cognition a priori, but only those through which we cognize that now certain representations, intuitions, or conceptions are applied or are possible only a priori. That is to say, that a priori possibility of cognition and the a priori use of it are transcendental. Therefore neither is space, nor any a priori geometrical determination of space, a transcendental representation, but only the knowledge that such a representation is not of empirical origin, and the possibility of its relating to objects of experience, although itself a priori, can be called transcendental. So also the application of space to objects in general would be transcendental, but if it be limited to objects of sense, it is empirical. Thus the distinction of the transcendental and empirical belongs only to the critique of cognitions, and does not concern the relation of these to their object. Accordingly, in the expectation that there may perhaps be conceptions which relate a priori to objects, not as pure or sensuous intuitions, but merely as acts of pure thought, which are therefore conceptions, but neither of empirical nor aesthetical origin, in this expectation, I say, we form to ourselves, by anticipation, the idea of a science of pure understanding and rational cognition, by means of which we may cogitate objects entirely a priori. A science of this kind, which should determine the origin, the extent, and the objective validity of such cognitions, must be called transcendental logic, because it has not, like general logic, to do with the laws of understanding and reason in relation to empirical as well as pure rational cognitions without distinction, but concerns itself with these only in an a priori relation to objects. 3. Of the division of general logic into analytic and dialectic. the old question with which people sought to push logicians into a corner, so that they must either have recourse to pitiful sophisms or confess their ignorance, and consequently the vanity of their whole art, is this: what is truth? The definition of the word truth, to wit, the accordance of the cognition with its object, is presupposed in the question, but we desire to be told, in the answer to it, what is the universal and secure criterion of the truth of every cognition. To know what questions we may reasonably propose is in itself a strong evidence of sagacity and intelligence. For if a question be in itself absurd and unsusceptible of a rational answer, it is attended with the danger, not to mention the shame that falls upon the person who proposes it, of seducing the unguarded listener into making absurd answers, and we are presented with the ridiculous spectacle of one, as the ancients said, milking the he-goat, and the other holding a sieve. If truth consists in the accordance of a cognition with its object, this object must be ipso facto distinguished from all others, for a cognition is false if it does not accord with the object to which it relates, although it contains something which may be affirmed of other objects. Now a universal criterion of truth would be that which is valid for all cognitions without distinction of their objects. But it is evident that since, in the case of such a criterion, we make abstraction of all the content of a cognition, that is, of all relation to its object, and truth relates precisely to this content, it must be utterly absurd to ask for a mark of the truth of this content of cognition, and that, accordingly, a sufficient, and at the same time universal, test of truth cannot possibly be found. As we have already termed the content of a cognition its matter, we shall say, of the truth of our cognitions in respect of their matter, no universal test can be demanded, because such a demand is self-contradictory. On the other hand, with regard to our cognition in respect of its mere form, excluding all content, it is equally manifest that logic, in so far as it exhibits the universal and necessary laws of the understanding, must in these very laws present us with criteria of truth. Whatever contradicts these rules is false, because thereby the understanding is made to contradict its own universal laws of thought, that is, to contradict itself. These criteria, however, apply solely to the form of truth, that is, of thought in general, and in so far they are perfectly accurate, yet not sufficient. For although a cognition may be perfectly accurate as to logical form, that is, not self-contradictory, it is notwithstanding quite possible that it may not stand in agreement with its object. Consequently, the merely logical criterion of truth, namely, the accordance of a cognition with the universal and formal laws of understanding and reason, is nothing more than the conditio sine qua non, or negative condition of all truth. Farther than this logic cannot go, and the error which depends not on the form but on the content of the cognition, it has no test to discover. General logic, then, resolves the whole formal business of understanding and reason into its elements, and exhibits them as principles of all logical judging of our cognitions. This part of logic may, therefore, be called analytic, and is at least the negative test of truth, because all cognitions must first of all be estimated and tried according to these laws, before we proceed to investigate them in respect of their content, in order to discover whether they contain positive truth in regard to their object. Because, however, the mere form of a cognition, accurately as it may accord with logical laws, is insufficient to supply us with material, objective truth, no one, by means of logic alone, can venture to predicate anything of or decide concerning objects, unless he has obtained, independently of logic, well-grounded information about them, in order afterwards to examine, according to logical laws, into the use and connection, in a cohering whole of that information, or, what is still better, merely to test it by them. Notwithstanding, there lies so seductive a charm in the possession of a specious art like this, an art which gives to all our cognitions the form of the understanding, although with respect to the content thereof we may be sadly deficient, that general logic, which is merely a canon of judgment, has been employed as an organon for the actual production, or rather for the semblance of production, of objective assertions, and has thus been grossly misapplied. Now general logic, in its assumed character of organon, is called dialectic. Different as are the significations in which the ancients used this term for a science or an art, we may safely infer, from their actual employment of it, that with them it was nothing else than a logic of illusion, a sophistical art for giving ignorance, nay, even intentional sophistries, the coloring of truth, in which the thoroughness of procedure which logic requires was imitated, and that topic employed to cloak the empty pretensions. Now it may be taken as a safe and useful warning that general logic, considered as an organon, must always be a logic of illusion, that is, be dialectical, for, as it teaches us nothing whatever respecting the content of our cognitions, but merely the formal conditions of their accordance with the understanding, which do not relate to, and are quite indifferent in respect of objects, any attempt to employ it as an instrument, organon, in order to extend and enlarge the range of our knowledge, must end in mere prating, any one being able to maintain or oppose, with some appearance of truth, any single assertion whatever. Such instruction is quite unbecoming the dignity of philosophy. For these reasons we have chosen to denominate this part of logic dialectic, in the sense of a critique of dialectical illusion, and we wish the term to be so understood in this place. 4. Of the division of transcendental logic into transcendental, analytic, and dialectic. In transcendental logic we isolate the understanding, as in transcendental aesthetic, the sensibility, and select from our cognition merely that part of thought which has its origin in the understanding alone. The exercise of this pure cognition, however, depends upon this as its condition, that objects to which it may be applied be given to us in intuition, for without intuition the whole of our cognition is without objects, and is therefore quite void. That part of transcendental logic, then, which treats of the elements of pure cognition of the understanding, and of the principles without which no object at all can be thought, is transcendental analytic, and at the same time a logic of truth, for no cognition can contradict it, without losing at the same time all content, that is, losing all reference to an object, and therefore all truth. But because we are very easily seduced into employing these pure cognitions and principles of the understanding by themselves, and that even beyond the boundaries of experience, which yet is the only source whence we can obtain matter, objects, on which those pure conceptions may be employed, understanding runs the risk of making, by means of empty sophisms, a material and objective use of the mere formal principles of the pure understanding, and of passing judgments on objects without distinction, objects which are not given to us, nay, perhaps cannot be given to us in any way. Now, as it ought properly to be only a canon for judging of the empirical use of the understanding, this kind of logic is misused when we seek to employ it as an organon of the universal and unlimited exercise of the understanding, and attempt with the pure understanding alone to judge synthetically, affirm, and determine respecting objects in general. In this case the exercise of the pure understanding becomes dialectical. The second part of our transcendental logic must therefore be a critique of dialectical illusion, and this critique we shall term transcendental dialectic, not meaning it as an art of producing dogmatically such illusion, an art which is unfortunately too current among the practitioners of metaphysical juggling, but as a critique of understanding and reason in regard to their hyperphysical use. This critique will expose the groundless nature of the pretensions of these two faculties, and invalidate their claims to the discovery and enlargement of our cognitions merely by means of transcendental principles, and show that the proper employment of these faculties is to test the judgments made by the pure understanding, and to guard it from sophistical delusion. End of section 6.
The Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant, Chapter 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Of the division of transcendental logic into transcendental analytic and dialectic. In transcendental logic we isolate the understanding, as in transcendental aesthetic, the sensibility, and select from our cognition merely that part of thought which has its origin in the understanding alone. The exercise of this pure cognition, however, depends upon this as its condition, that objects to which it may be applied be given to us in intuition, for without intuition the whole of our cognition is without objects, and is therefore quite void. That part of transcendental logic, then, which treats of the elements of pure cognition, of the understanding, and of the principles without which no object at all can be thought, is transcendental analytic, and at the same time a logic of truth. For no cognition can contradict it without losing at the same time all content, that is, losing all reference to an object, and therefore all truth. But because we are very easily seduced into employing these pure cognitions and principles of the understanding by themselves, and that even beyond the boundaries of experience, which yet is the only source whence we can obtain matter, objects, on which those pure conceptions may be employed, understanding runs the risk of making, by means of empty sophisms, a material and objective use of the mere formal principles of the pure understanding, and of passing judgments on objects without distinction. Objects which are not given to us, nay, perhaps cannot be given to us in any way. Now, as it ought properly to be only a canon for judging of the empirical use of the understanding, this kind of logic is misused when we seek to employ it as an organ of the universal and unlimited exercise of the understanding, and attempt with the pure understanding alone to judge synthetically, affirm, and determine respecting objects in general. In this case the exercise of the pure understanding becomes dialectical. The second part of our transcendental logic must therefore be a critique of dialectical illusion, and this critique we shall term transcendental dialectic, not meaning it as an art of producing dogmatically such illusion, an art which is unfortunately too current among the practitioners of metaphysical juggling, but as a critique of understanding and reason in regard to their hyperphysical use. This critique will expose the groundless nature of the pretensions of these two faculties, and invalidate their claims to the discovery and enlargement of our cognitions merely by means of transcendental principles, and show that the proper employment of these faculties is to test the judgments made by the pure understanding, and to guard it from sophistical delusion. Transcendental Logic, First Division. Transcendental Analytic, SS1. Transcendental Analytic is the dissection of the whole of our a priori knowledge into the elements of the pure cognition of the understanding. In order to effect our purpose it is necessary, 1. That the conceptions be pure and not empirical, 2. That they belong not to intuition and sensibility, but to thought and understanding, 3. That they be elementary conceptions, and as such quite different from deduced or compound conceptions. 4. That our table of these elementary conceptions be complete, and fill up the whole sphere of the pure understanding. Now this completeness of a science cannot be accepted with confidence on the guarantee of a mere estimate of its existence in an aggregate formed only by means of repeated experiments and attempts. The completeness which we require is possible only by means of an idea of the totality, of the a priori cognition, of the understanding, and through the thereby determined division of the conceptions which form the said whole, consequently only by means of their connection in a system. Pure understanding distinguishes itself not merely from everything empirical, but also completely from all sensibility. It is a unity self-subsistent, self-sufficient, and not to be enlarged by any additions from without. Hence the sum of its cognition constitutes a system to be determined by and comprised under an idea, and the completeness and articulation of this system can at the same time serve as a test of the correctness and genuineness of all the parts of cognition that belong to it. The whole of this part of transcendental logic consists of 2 books, of which the one contains the conceptions, and the other the principles of pure understanding. Book 1, subsection 2, Analytic of Conceptions. By the term analytic of conceptions I do not understand the analysis of these, or the usual process in philosophical investigations of dissecting the conceptions which present themselves according to their content, and so making them clear, but I mean the hitherto little attempted dissection of the faculty of understanding itself, in order to investigate the possibility of conceptions a priori, by looking for them in the understanding alone, as their birthplace, and analyzing the pure use of this faculty. For this is the proper duty of a transcendental philosophy. What remains is the logical treatment of the conceptions in philosophy in general. We shall therefore follow up the pure conceptions even to their germs and beginnings in the human understanding in which they lie, until they are developed on occasions presented by experience, and, freed by the same understanding from the empirical conditions attaching to them, are set forth in their unalloyed purity. Chapter 1 of the transcendental clue to the discovery of all pure conceptions of the understanding. Subsection 3. Introductory. When we call into play a faculty of cognition, different conceptions manifest themselves according to the different circumstances, and make known this faculty, and assemble themselves into a more or less extensive collection, according to the time or penetration that has been applied to the consideration of them. Where this process, conducted as it is mechanically, so to speak, will end, cannot be determined with certainty. Besides, the conceptions which we discover in this haphazard manner present themselves by no means in order and systematic unity, but are at last coupled together only according to resemblances to each other, and arranged in series according to the quantity of their content, from the simpler to the more complex, series which are anything but systematic, though not altogether without a certain kind of method in their construction. Transcendental philosophy has the advantage, and moreover the duty, of searching for its conceptions according to a principle, because these conceptions spring pure and unmixed out of the understanding as an absolute unity, and therefore must be connected with each other according to one conception or idea. A connection of this kind, however, furnishes us with a ready, prepared rule, by which its proper place may be assigned to every pure conception of the understanding, and the completeness of the system of all be determined a priori, both which would otherwise have been dependent on mere choice or chance. Subsection 4, Section 1. Of defined above use of understanding in general. The understanding was defined above only negatively, as a non-sensuous faculty of cognition. Now, independently of sensibility, we cannot possibly have any intuition. Consequently, the understanding is no faculty of intuition. But besides intuitions, there is no other mode of cognition except through conceptions. Consequently, the cognition of at least every human, understanding is a cognition through conceptions, not intuitive, but discursive. All intuitions, as sensuous, depend on affectations, conceptions, therefore, upon functions. By the word function, I understand the unity of the act of arranging diverse representations under one common representation. Conceptions, then, are based on the spontaneity of thought, as sensuous intuitions are on the receptivity of impressions. Now, the understanding cannot make any other use of these conceptions than to judge by means of them. As no representation, except an intuition, relates immediately to its object, a conception never relates immediately to an object, but only to some other representation thereof, be that an intuition or itself a conception. A judgment, therefore, is the mediate cognition of an object, consequently, the representation of a representation of it. In every judgment there is a conception which applies to and is valid for many other conceptions, and which, among these, comprehends also a given representation, this last being immediately connected with an object. For example, in the judgment, all bodies are divisible, our conception of divisible applies to various other conceptions. Among these, however, it is here particularly applied to the conception of body, and this conception of body relates to certain phenomena which occur to us. These objects, therefore, are mediately represented by the conception of divisibility. All judgments, accordingly, are functions of unity in our representations, inasmuch as, instead of an immediate, a higher representation which comprises this and various others, is used for our cognition of the object, and thereby many possible cognitions are collected into one. But we can reduce all acts of the understanding to judgments, so that understanding may be represented as the faculty of judging. For it is, according to what has been said above, a faculty of thought. Now thought is cognition by means of conceptions. But conceptions, as predicates of possible judgments, relate to some representation of a yet undetermined object. Thus the conception of body indicates something, for example metal, which can be cognized by means of that conception. It is therefore a conception for the reason alone that other representations are contained under it, by means of which it can relate to objects. It is therefore the predicate to a possible judgment. For example, every metal is a body. All the functions of the understanding therefore can be discovered when we can completely exhibit the functions of unity in judgments. And that this may be effected very easily, the following section will show. Subsection 5, section 2, of the logical function of the understanding in judgments. If we abstract the content of a judgment and consider only the intellectual form thereof, we find that the function of thought in a judgment can be brought under 4 heads, of which each contains 3 momenta. These may be conveniently represented in the following table. 1. Quantity of judgments, universal, particular, singular. 2. Quality, affirmative, negative, infinite. 3. Relation, categorical, hypothetical, disjunctive. 4. Modality, problematical, assertorical, apodeictical. As this division appears to differ in some, though not essential, points from the usual technique of logicians, the following observations for the prevention of otherwise possible misunderstanding will not be without their use. 1. Logicians say, with justice, that in the use of judgments in syllogisms, singular judgments may be treated like universal ones. For, precisely because a singular judgment has no extent at all, its predicate cannot refer to a part of that which is contained in the conception of the subject and be excluded from the rest. The predicate is valid for the whole conception just as if it were a general conception, and had extent to the whole of which the predicate applied. On the other hand, let us compare a singular with a general judgment, merely as a cognition in regard to quantity. The singular judgment relates to the general one, as unity to infinity, and is therefore in itself essentially different. Thus, if we estimate a singular judgment, judicium singulare, not merely according to its intrinsic validity as a judgment, but also as a cognition generally, according to its quantity in comparison with that of other cognitions, it is then entirely different from a general judgment, judicium commune, and in a complete table of the momenta of thought deserves a separate place, though indeed this would not be necessary in a logic limited merely to the consideration of the use of judgments in reference to each other. 2. In like manner, in transcendental logic, infinite must be distinguished from affirmative judgments, although in general logic they are rightly enough classed under affirmative. General logic abstracts all content of the predicate, though it be negative, and only considers whether the said predicate be affirmed or denied of the subject. But transcendental logic considers also the worth or content of this logical affirmation, an affirmation by means of a merely negative predicate, and inquires how much the sum total of our cognition gains by this affirmation. For example, if I say of the soul, it is not mortal, by this negative judgment I should at least ward off error. Now, by the proposition, the soul is not mortal, I have, in respect of the logical form, really affirmed, inasmuch as I thereby place the soul in the unlimited sphere of immortal beings. Now, because of the whole sphere of possible existences, the mortal occupies one part, and the immortal the other. Neither more nor less is affirmed by the proposition that the soul is one among the infinite multitude of things which remain over, when I take away the whole mortal part. But by this proceeding we accomplish only this much, that the infinite sphere of all possible existences is in so far limited that the mortal is excluded from it, and the soul is placed in the remaining part of the extent of this sphere. But this part remains, notwithstanding this exception, infinite, and more parts may be taken away from the whole sphere, without in the slightest degree thereby augmenting or affirmatively determining our conception of the soul. These judgments, therefore, infinite in respect of their logical extent, are, in respect of the content of their cognition, merely limitative. They are consequently entitled to a place in our transcendental table of all the momenta of thought and judgments, because the function of the understanding exercised by them may perhaps be of importance in the field of its pure a priori cognition. 3. All relations of thought in judgments are those a. of the predicate to the subject, b. of the principle to its consequence, c. of the divided cognition and all the members of the division to each other. In the first of these three classes we consider only two conceptions, in the second two judgments, in the third several judgments in relation to each other. The hypothetical proposition, if perfect justice exists, the obstinately wicked are punished, contains properly the relation to each other of two propositions, namely, perfect justice exists, and the obstinately wicked are punished. Whether these propositions are in themselves true is a question not here decided. Nothing is cogitated by means of this judgment except a certain consequence. Finally, the disjunctive judgment contains a relation of two or more propositions to each other, a relation not of consequence, but of logical opposition, in so far as the sphere of the one proposition excludes that of the other. but it contains at the same time a relation of community, in so far as all propositions taken together fill up the sphere of the cognition. The disjunctive judgment contains, therefore, the relation of the parts of the whole sphere of a cognition, since the sphere of each part is a complemental part of the sphere of the other, each contributing to form the sum total of the divided cognition. Take, for example, the proposition, the world exists either through blind chance, or through internal necessity, or through an external cause. Each of these propositions embraces a part of the sphere of our possible cognition as to the existence of a world. All of them taken together, the whole sphere. To take the cognition out of one of these spheres is equivalent to placing it in one of the others, and, on the other hand, to place it in one sphere is equivalent to taking it out of the rest. There is, therefore, in a disjunctive judgment a certain community of cognitions, which consists in this, that they mutually exclude each other, yet thereby determine as a whole the true cognition, inasmuch as, taken together, they make up the complete content of a particular given cognition. And this is all that I find necessary for the sake of what follows to remark in this place. The modality of judgments is a quite peculiar function with this distinguishing characteristic, that it contributes nothing to the content of a judgment. For, besides quantity, quality, and relation, there is nothing more that constitutes the content of a judgment, but concerns itself only with the value of the copula in relation to thought in general. Problematical judgments are those in which the affirmation or negation is accepted as merely possible, ad libitum. If the assertorical, we regard the propositional as real, true. In apodeictical, we look on it as necessary. Thus two judgments, antecedents and consequens, the relation of which constitutes a hypothetical judgment, likewise those the members of the division, in whose reciprocity the disjunctive consists, are only problematical. In the example above given, the proposition, "there exists perfect justice," is not stated assertorically, but as an ad libitum judgment, which someone may choose to adopt, and the consequence alone is assertorical. Hence such judgments may be obviously false, and yet taken problematically to be conditions of our cognition of the truth. Yet the proposition, "the world exists only by blind chance," is in the disjunctive judgment of problematical import only. That is to say, one may accept it for the moment, and it helps us, like the indication of the wrong road among all the roads that one can take, to find out the true proposition. The problematical proposition is, therefore, that which expresses only logical possibility, which is not objective. That is, it expresses a free choice to admit the validity of such a proposition, a merely arbitrary reception of it into the understanding. The assertorical speaks of logical reality of truth, as, for example, in a hypothetical syllogism. The antecedents present itself in a problematical form in the major, in an assertorical form in the minor, and it shows that the proposition is in harmony with the laws of the understanding. The apodeictical proposition cogitates the assertorical as determined by these very laws of the understanding, consequently as affirming a priori, and in this manner it expresses logical necessity. Now, because all is here gradually incorporated with the understanding, inasmuch as the first place we judge problematically, then accept assertorically our judgment as true, lastly affirm it as inseparably united with the understanding, that is, as necessary and apodeictical. We may safely reckon these three functions of modality as so many momenta of thought. SS 6, Section 3 of the pure conceptions of the understanding or categories. General logic, as has been repeatedly said, makes abstraction of all content of cognition and expects to receive representations from some other quarter in order, by means of analysis, to convert them into conceptions. On the contrary, transcendental logic has lying before it the manifold content of a priori sensibility, which transcendental aesthetic presents to it in order to give matter to the pure conceptions of the understanding, without which transcendental logic would have no content, and be therefore utterly void. Now space and time contain an infinite diversity of determinations of pure a priori intuition, but are nevertheless the condition of the mind's receptivity, under which alone it can obtain representations of objects, and which, consequently, must always affect the conception of these objects. But the spontaneity of thought requires that this diversity be examined after a certain manner, received into the mind, and connected in order afterwards to form a cognition out of it. This process I call synthesis. By the word synthesis, in its most general signification, I understand the process of joining different representations to each other, and of comprehending their diversity in one cognition. This synthesis is pure when the diversity is not given empirically, but a priori, as that in space and time. Our representations must be given previously to any analysis of them, and no conceptions can arise, quod their content, analytically. But the synthesis of a diversity, be it given a priori or empirically, is the first requisite for the production of a cognition, which in its beginning indeed may be crude and confused, and therefore in need of analysis. Still, synthesis is that by which alone the elements of our cognitions are collected and united into a certain content. Consequently, it is the first thing on which we must fix our attention, if we wish to investigate the origin of our knowledge. Synthesis, generally speaking, is, as we shall afterwards see, the mere operation of the imagination, a blind but indispensable function of the soul, without which we should have no cognition whatever, but of the working of which we are seldom even conscious. But to reduce this synthesis to conceptions is a function of the understanding by means of which we attain to cognition, in the proper meaning of the term. Pure synthesis, represented generally, gives us the pure conception of the understanding, but by this pure synthesis I mean that which rests upon a basis of a priori synthetical unity. Thus our numeration, and this is more observable in large numbers, is a synthesis according to conceptions, because it takes place according to a common basis of unity, for example the decade. By means of this conception, therefore, the unity in the synthesis of the manifold becomes necessary. By means of analysis, different representations are brought under one conception, an operation of which general logic treats. On the other hand, the duty of transcendental logic is to reduce the conceptions, not representations, but the pure synthesis of representations. The first thing which must be given to us for the sake of the a priori cognition of all objects is the diversity of the pure intuition. The synthesis of this diversity by means of the imagination is the second. But this gives as yet no cognition. The conceptions which give unity to this pure synthesis, and which consist solely in the representation of this necessary synthetical unity, furnish the third requisite for the cognition of an object, and these conceptions are given by the understanding. The same function which gives unity to the different representation in a judgment gives also unity to the mere synthesis of different representations in an intuition, and this unity we call the pure conception of the understanding. Thus the same understanding, and by the same operations, whereby in conceptions, by means of analytical unity, it produced the logical form of a judgment, introduces, by means of the synthetical unity of the manifold in intuition, a transcendental content into its representations, on which account they are called pure conceptions of the understanding, and they apply a priori to objects, a result not within the power of general logic. In this manner there arise exactly so many pure conceptions of the understanding, applying a priori to objects of intuition in general, as there are logical functions in all possible judgments. For there is no other function or faculty existing in the understanding besides those enumerated in that table. These conceptions we shall, with Aristotle, call categories, our purpose being originally identical with his, notwithstanding the great difference in execution. Table of the categories. 1. Of quantity, unity, plurality, totality. 2. Of quality, reality, negation, limitation. 3. Of inherence and subsistence, substantia et accidens. Of causality and dependence, cause and effect. Of community, reciprocity between the agent and the patient. 4. Of modality, possibility, impossibility, existence, non-existence, necessity, contingence. This, then, is a catalogue of all the originally pure conceptions of the synthesis, which the understanding contains a priori, and these conceptions alone entitle it to be called a pure understanding, inasmuch as only by them it can render the manifold of intuition conceivable, in other words, think an object of intuition. This division is made systematically from a common principle, namely the faculty of judgment, which is just the same as the power of thought, and has not arisen rhapsodically from a search at haphazard after pure conceptions, respecting the full number of which we never could be certain, inasmuch as we employ induction alone in our search, without considering that in this way we can never understand wherefore precisely these conceptions, and none others, abide in the pure understanding. It was a design worthy of an acute thinker like Aristotle to search for these fundamental conceptions. Destitute, however, of any guiding principle, he picked them up just as they occurred to him, and at first hunted out 10, which he called categories, predicaments. Afterwards he believed that he had discovered 5 others which were added under the name of post-predicaments, but his catalogue still remained defective. Besides, there are to be found among them some of the modes of pure sensibility, quando, ubi, situs, also prius, simul, and likewise an empirical conception, motus, which can by no means belong to this genealogical register of the pure understanding. Moreover, there are deduced conceptions, actio, passio, enumerated among the original conceptions, and of the latter some are entirely wanting. With regard to these, it is to be remarked that the categories, as the true primitive conceptions of the pure understanding, have also their pure deduced conceptions, which, in a complete system of transcendental philosophy, must by no means be passed over, though in a merely critical essay we must be contented with the simple mention of the fact. Let it be allowed to call these pure but deduced conceptions of the understanding the predictables of the pure understanding, in contradiction to predicaments. If we are in possession of the original and primitive, the deduced and subsidiary conceptions can easily be added, and the genealogical tree of the understanding completely delineated. As my present aim is not to set forth the complete system, but merely the principles of one, I reserve this task for another time. It may be easily executed by any one who will refer to the ontological manuals, and subordinate to the category of causality, for example, the predictables of force, action, passion, to that of community, those of presence and resistance, to the categories of modality, those of origination, extinction, change, and so with the rest. The categories combined with the modes of pure sensibility or with one another afford a great number of deduced a priori conceptions, a complete enumeration of which would be a useful and not unpleasant, but in this place a perfectly dispensable occupation. I purposely omit the definitions of the categories in this treatise. I shall analyze these conceptions only so far as is necessary for the doctrine of method, which is to form a part of this critique. In a system of pure reason, definitions of them would be with justice demanded of me, but to give them here would only bide from our view the main aim of our investigation, at the same time raising doubts and objections, and consideration of which, without injustice to our main purpose, may be very well postponed till another opportunity. Meanwhile it ought to be sufficiently clear, from the little we have already said on this subject, that the formation of a complete vocabulary of pure conceptions, accompanied by all the requisite explanations, is not only a possible, but an easy undertaking. The compartments already exist. It is only necessary to fill them up, and a systematic topic like the present indicates with perfect precision the proper place to which each conception belongs, while it readily points out any that have not yet been filled up. SS 7. Our table of the categories suggests considerations of some importance which may perhaps have significant results in regard to the scientific form of all rational cognitions. For, that this table is useful in the theoretical part of philosophy, nay, indispensable for the sketching of the complete plan of a science, so far as that science rests upon conceptions a priori, and for dividing it mathematically according to fixed principles, it is most manifest from the fact that it contains all the elementary conceptions of the understanding, nay, even the form of a system of these in the understanding itself, and consequently indicates all the momenta, and also the internal arrangement of a projected speculative science, as I have elsewhere shown. Here follows some of these observations. 1. This table, which contains 4 classes of conceptions of the understanding, may, in the first instance, be divided into 2 classes, the first of which relates to objects of intuition, pure as well as empirical, the second to the existence of these objects, either in relation to one another or to the understanding. The former of these classes of categories I would entitle the mathematical, and the latter the dynamical categories. The former, as we see, has no correlates. These are only to be found in the second class. This difference must have a ground in the nature of the human understanding. 2. The number of the categories in each class is always the same, namely 3, a fact which also demands some consideration, because in all other cases division a priori through conceptions is necessarily dichotomy. It is to be added that the third category in each triad always arises from the combination of the second with the first. Thus totality is nothing else but plurality contemplated as unity. Limitation is merely reality conjoined with negation. Community is the causality of a substance, reciprocally determining, and determined by other substances. And finally, necessity is nothing but existence, which is given through the possibility itself. Let it not be supposed, however, that the third category is merely a deduced and not a primitive conception of the pure understanding. For the conjunction of the first and second, in order to produce the third conception, requires a particular function of the understanding, which is by no means identical with those which are exercised in the first and second. Thus the conception of a number, which belongs to the category of totality, is not always possible where the conceptions of multitude and unity exist, for example in the representation of the infinite. Or, if I conjoin the conception of a cause with that of a substance, it does not follow that the conception of influence, that is, how one substance can be the cause of something in another substance, will be understood from that. Thus it is evident that a particular act of the understanding is here necessary, and so in the other instances. 3. With respect to one category, namely that of community, which is found in the third class, it is not so easy as with the others to detect its accordance with the form of the disjunctive judgment which corresponds to it in the table of the logical functions. In order to assure ourselves of this accordance, we must observe that in every disjunctive judgment, the sphere of the judgment, that is, the complex of all that is contained in it, is represented as a whole divided into parts, and, since one part cannot be contained in the other, they are cogitated as coordinated with, not subordinated to, each other, so that they do not determine each other unilaterally, as in a linear series, but reciprocally, as in an aggregate. If one member of the division is posited, all the rest are excluded, and conversely. Now a like connection is cogitated in a whole of things, for one thing is not subordinated as effect to another as cause of its existence, but, on the contrary, is coordinated contemporaneously and reciprocally as a cause in relation to the determination of the others. For example, in a body, the parts of which mutually attract and repel each other. And this is an entirely different kind of connection from that which we find in the mere relation of the cause to the effect, the principle to the consequence, for in such a connection the consequence does not in its turn determine the principle, and therefore does not constitute with the latter a whole, just as the Creator does not with the world make up a whole. The process of understanding by which it represents to itself the sphere of a divided conception is employed also when we think of a thing as divisible, and in the same manner as the members of the division in the former exclude one another, and yet are connected in one sphere, so the understanding represents to itself the parts of the latter as having, each of them, an existence, as substances, independently of the others, and yet as united in one whole. SS 8. In the transcendental philosophy of the ancients there exists one more leading division, which contains pure conceptions of the understanding, and which, although not numbered among the categories, ought, according to them, as conceptions a priori, to be valid of objects. But in this case they would augment the number of the categories, which cannot be. These are set forth in the proposition so renowned among the schoolmen, quolibet ens est unum verum bonum. Now, though the inferences from this principle were mere tautological propositions, and though it is allowed only by courtesy to retain a place in modern metaphysics, yet a thought which maintained itself for such a length of time, however empty it seems to be, deserves an investigation of its origin, and justifies the conjecture that it must be grounded in some law of the understanding, which, as is often the case, has only been erroneously interpreted. These pretended transcendental predicates are, in fact, nothing but logical requisites and criteria of all cognition of objects, and they employ as the basis of this cognition the categories of quantity, namely unity, plurality, and totality. But these, which must be taken as material conditions, that is, as belonging to the possibility of things themselves, they employ merely in a formal signification, as belonging to the logical requisites of all cognition, and yet most unguardedly changed these criteria of thought into properties of objects as things in themselves, Now, in every cognition of an object there is unity of conception which may be called qualitative unity, so far as by this term we understand only the unity in our connection of the manifold. For example, unity of the theme in a play, an oration, or a story. Secondly, there is truth in respect of the deductions from it. The more true deductions we have from a given conception, the more criteria of its objective reality. This we might call the qualitative plurality of characteristic marks which belong to a conception as to a common foundation, but are not cogitated as a quantity in it. Thirdly, there is perfection, which consists in this, that the plurality falls back upon the unity of the conception and accords completely with that conception and with no other. This we may denominate qualitative completeness. Hence, it is evident that these logical criteria of the possibility of cognition are merely the three categories of quantity modified and transformed to suit an unauthorized manner of applying them, that is to say, the three categories in which the unity in the production of the quantum must be homogeneous throughout, are transformed solely with a view to the connection of heterogeneous parts of cognition in one act of consciousness, by means of the quality of the cognition, which is the principle of that connection. Thus the criterion of the possibility of a conception, not of its object, is the definition of it, in which the unity of the conception, the truth of all that may be immediately deduced from it, and finally the completeness of what has been thus deduced, constitute the requisites for the reproduction of the whole conception. Thus also the criterion or test of an hypothesis is the intelligibility of the received principle of explanation, or its unity, without help from any subsidiary hypothesis, the truth of our deductions from it, consistency with each other and with experience, and lastly the completeness of the principle of the explanation of these deductions, which refer to neither more nor less than what was admitted in the hypothesis, restoring analytically and a posteriori what was cogitated synthetically and a priori. By the conceptions therefore of unity, truth, and perfection we have made no addition to the transcendental table of the categories, which is complete without them. We have, on the contrary, merely employed the three categories of quantity, setting aside their application to objects of experience, as general logical laws of the consistency of cognition with itself. End of chapter 4.
Section 8. The Critique of Pure Reason, by Immanuel Kant. Transcendental Doctrine of Elements. Part 2nd. Transcendental Logic. First Division. Transcendental Analytic. Book 1. Analytic of Conceptions. Chapter 2. Of the Deduction of the Pure Conceptions of the Understanding. Section 1. Of the Principles of Transcendental Deduction in general.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gesine. The Critique of Pure Reason, by Immanuel Kant. Translated by J.M.D. Michael John. Chapter 2. Of the Deduction of the Pure Conceptions of the Understanding. Section 1. Of the Principles of a Transcendental Deduction in General. Part 1. Teachers of jurisprudence, when speaking of rights and claims, distinguish in a cause the question of right, quid juris, from the question of fact, quid facti. And while they demand proof of both, they give to the proof of the former, which goes to establish right or claim in law, the name of deduction. Now we make use of a great number of empirical conceptions, without opposition from anyone, and consider ourselves, even without any attempt at deduction, justified in attaching to them a sense and a supposititious signification, because we have always experience at hand to demonstrate their objective reality. There exist also, however, usurped conceptions, such as fortune, fate, which circulate with almost universal indulgence, and yet are occasionally challenged by the question, quid juris? In such cases, we have great difficulty in discovering any deduction for these terms, inasmuch as we cannot produce any manifest ground of right, either from experience or from reason, on which the claim to employ them can be founded. Among the many conceptions which make up the very variegated web of human cognition, some are destined for pure use a priori, independent of all experience, and their title to be so employed always requires a deduction, inasmuch as, to justify such use of them, proofs from experience are not sufficient. But it is necessary to know how these conceptions can apply to objects without being derived from experience. I term, therefore, an examination of the manner in which conceptions can apply a priori to objects, the transcendental deduction of conceptions, and I distinguish it from the empirical deduction, which indicates the mode in which conception is obtained through experience and reflection thereon. Consequently, does not concern itself with the right, but only with the fact of our obtaining conceptions in such and such a manner. We have already seen that we are in possession of two perfectly different kinds of conceptions, which nevertheless agree with each other in this, that they both apply to objects completely a priori. These are the conceptions of space and time as forms of sensibility, and the categories as pure conceptions of the understanding. To attempt an empirical deduction of either of these classes would be labour in vain, because the distinguishing characteristic of their nature consists in this, that they apply to their objects without having borrowed anything from experience towards the representation of them. Consequently, if a deduction of these conceptions is necessary, it must always be transcendental. Meanwhile, with respect to these conceptions, as with respect to all our cognition, we certainly may discover in experience, if not the principle of their possibility, yet the occasioning causes of their production. It will be found that the impressions of sense give the first occasion for bringing into action the whole faculty of cognition, and for the production of experience, which contains two very dissimilar elements, namely, a matter for cognition, given by the senses, and a certain form for the arrangement of this matter, arising out of the inner fountain of pure intuition and thought. And these, on occasion given by sensuous impressions, are called into exercise and produce conceptions. Such an investigation into the first efforts of our faculty of cognition to mount from particular perceptions to general conceptions is undoubtedly of great utility, and we have to thank the celebrated Locke for having first opened the way for this inquiry. But a deduction of the pure a priori conceptions of course never can be made in this way, seeing that, in regard to their future employment, which must be entirely independent of experience, they must have a far different certificate of birth to show from that of a descent from experience. This attempted physiological derivation, which cannot properly be called deduction, because it relates merely to a quaestio facti, I shall entitle an explanation of the possession of a pure cognition. It is therefore manifest that there can only be a transcendental deduction of these conceptions, and by no means an empirical one. Also, that all attempts at an empirical deduction, in regard to pure a priori conceptions, are vain, and can only be made by one who does not understand the altogether peculiar nature of these cognitions. But although it is admitted that the only possible deduction of pure a priori cognition is a transcendental deduction, it is not, for that reason, perfectly manifest that such a deduction is absolutely necessary. We have already traced to their sources the conceptions of space and time by means of a transcendental deduction, and we have explained and determined their objective validity a priori. Geometry, nevertheless, advances steadily and securely in the province of pure a priori cognitions, without needing to ask from philosophy any certificate as to the pure and legitimate origin of its fundamental conception of space. But the use of the conception in this science extends only to the external world of sense, the pure form of the intuition of which is space. And in this world, therefore, all geometrical cognition, because it is founded upon a priori intuition, possesses immediate evidence, and the objects of this cognition are given a priori, as regards their form, in intuition by and through the cognition itself. With the pure conceptions of understanding, on the contrary, commences the absolute necessity of seeking a transcendental deduction, not only of these conceptions themselves, but likewise of space, because, inasmuch as they make affirmations concerning objects not by means of the predicates of intuition and sensibility, but of pure thought a priori, they apply to objects without any of the conditions of sensibility. Besides, not being founded on experience, they are not presented with any object in a priori intuition upon which, antecedently to experience, they might base their synthesis. Hence results not only doubt as to the objective validity and proper limits of their use, but that even our conception of space is rendered equivocal. Inasmuch as we are very ready with the aid of the categories to carry the use of this conception beyond the conditions of sensuous intuition, and for this reason we have already found a transcendental deduction of it needful. The reader, then, must be quite convinced of the absolute necessity of a transcendental deduction before taking a single step in the field of pure reason, because otherwise he goes to work blindly, and after he has wandered about in all directions, returns to the state of utter ignorance from which he started. He ought, moreover, clearly to recognize beforehand the unavoidable difficulties of his undertaking, so that he may not afterwards complain of the obscurity in which the subject itself is deeply involved, or become too soon impatient of the obstacles in his path, because we have a choice of only two things: either at once to give up all pretensions to knowledge beyond the limits of possible experience, or to bring this critical investigation to completion. We have been able, with very little trouble, to make it comprehensible how the conceptions of space and time, although a priori cognitions, must necessarily apply to external objects, and render a synthetical cognition of these possible, independently of all experience. For inasmuch as only by means of such pure form of sensibility an object can appear to us, that is, be an object of empirical intuition, space and time are pure intuitions, which contain a priori the condition of the possibility of objects as phenomena, and an a priori synthesis in these intuitions possesses objective validity. On the other hand, the categories of the understanding do not represent the conditions under which objects are given to us in intuition. Objects can consequently appear to us without necessarily connecting themselves with these, and consequently without any necessity binding on the understanding to contain a priori the conditions of these objects. Thus we find ourselves involved in a difficulty which did not present itself in the sphere of sensibility. That is to say, we cannot discover how the subjective conditions of thought can have objective validity. In other words, can become conditions of the possibility of all cognition of objects. For phenomena may certainly be given to us in intuition without any help from the functions of the understanding. Let us take, for example, the conception of cause, which indicates a peculiar kind of synthesis, namely, that with something A, something entirely different B is connected according to a law. It is not a priori manifest why phenomena should contain anything of this kind. We are of course debarred from appealing for proof to experience, for the objective validity of this conception must be demonstrated a priori. And it hence remains doubtful a priori whether such a conception be not quite void and without any corresponding object among phenomena. For that objects of sensuous intuition must correspond to the formal conditions of sensibility existing a priori in the mind is quite evident from the fact that without these they could not be objects for us. But that they must also correspond to the conditions which understanding requires for the synthetical unity of thought is an assertion, the grounds for which are not so easily to be discovered. For phenomena might be so constituted as not to correspond to the conditions of the unity of thought, and all things might lie in such confusion that, for example, nothing could be met within the sphere of phenomena to suggest a law of synthesis, and so correspond to the conception of cause and effect, so that this conception would be quite void, null, and without significance. Phenomena would nevertheless continue to present objects to our intuition, for mere intuition does not in any respect stand in need of the functions of thought. If we sought to free ourselves from the labour of these investigations by saying, experience is constantly offering us examples of the relation of cause and effect in phenomena, and presents us with abundant opportunity of abstracting the conception of cause, and so at the same time of corroborating the objective validity of this conception, we should in this case be overlooking the fact that the conception of cause cannot arise in this way at all, that, on the contrary, it must either have an a priori basis in the understanding, or be rejected as a mere chimera. For this conception demands that something, A, should be of such a nature that something else, B, should follow from it necessarily, and according to an absolutely universal law. We may certainly collect from phenomena a law, according to which this or that usually happens. But the element of necessity is not to be found in it. Hence it is evident that to the synthesis of cause and effect belongs a dignity which is utterly wanting in any empirical synthesis, for it is no mere mechanical synthesis by means of addition, but a dynamical one. That is to say, the effect is not to be cogitated as merely annexed to the cause, but as posited by and through the cause, and resulting from it. The strict universality of this law never can be a characteristic of empirical laws, which obtain through induction only a comparative universality, that is, an extended range of practical application. But the pure conceptions of the understanding would entirely lose all their peculiar character if we treated them merely as the productions of experience. End of Chapter 2, Section 2, Part 1. Recorded by Gesine in May 2007.